The idea is I want you to create your own brushes. And you can do this if you don't have Photoshop, you can use Photopea because that will let you define your brushes as well. So I want you to look for 3 different types of brushes: atmospheric brushes, background brushes, and what I call messy junk brushes. What I want you to do is look for these brushes. And so here are examples of atmospheric brushes. So they're just basically clouds. Background brushes can be anything from some sort of landscape silhouette. And these messy brushes are just like a collection of random industrial parts and pieces and geometries that you can utilize as well. And then for this, you're going to create 3 separate landscapes. So there's going to be 3 separate Photoshop documents or artboards, and they're all going to share the idea that they're all within the same world, that they all belong together, but you're going to create these phases for each one. And so I have examples here. So let's say you create a world, but the first document would feature that world during the summertime. The next one would be the fall, next one would be the winter. Or you can do something that's genre-based, whatever your world is. It's like this fantasy, then it goes modern, and then it goes science fiction. You can do something that goes past, present, future. So pick one of these and think about the brushes that you create. And then you're going to hand in 3 documents, 3 Photoshop files. PNG files should be the format you submit. They'll be 11 by 17. And for this, just work at 72. And then what we'll do after you hand these in is we're going to combine them into one long image and then colorize them. And then we're going to split them into a foreground, background, and midground and animate them. And there's a couple ways that we're going to do that to create what's called a parallax animation. So when you're creating these, you're going to think about your foreground, midground, and background as you create. And so the process is going to be kind of like this. If I want to use atmospheric brushes, I can search for clouds. So I'll find all sorts of great atmospheric brushes, and clouds are great brushes to create. And what I could probably do is just find some interesting clouds, and on a Mac, I can just copy right from the image. So do like that Shift Control Command. On a Windows machine, it's the Windows key, Shift S, and just start grabbing things from a search. And then I can go into Photoshop, and here's an example of one that I did a while back. But here I'll create my new document. I'll make it 11 by 17 here, 11 by 17. So this will be the basis for my landscape. But sometimes what I do is as I start this, I will paste in what could potentially be a brush. And so this could be an atmospheric brush. And then the process, and I showed you this before, you just go to Edit, Define Pattern Brush, and there it is right there. Now I'm going to call this one Cloud 1. And then when I lay this down, I have these kind of instant clouds. So you may want to play with, again, we've talked about playing with color here, or you can actually play with the levels here too. So I can make a selection and hit Command L and adjust my levels for this. So maybe increasing the background there by moving the far left slider to the right, and then, oops, something that I didn't. And then inverting it by using Command I. And then when I define it this time, the clouds will be darker. And I may want to adjust even more levels. So levels will be a big role. And what you want to do with your levels is really get rid of the color in the background there. You want to have a white background. So I'm going to hit OK. And if you move the sliders to the left, you'll lighten the background. And now when I define this, I'm going to edit, define brush preset, call this clouds 2. I'll create a new layer and I'll hide that clouds that I just created and delete the selection. So I do a Command D, or I go to selection, select up here, and I deselect. And now I can apply these clouds, and you can play with scale. So it's a really quick way to create this background. Now, another part of this is when you create this and you have hard edges, what you can do is with your selection, you make a selection that is not as, that crops out some of the edges, and then go to filter, go to select, go to modify, and go to feather, and raise it up to, let's say, 40 or 50. And then when I go into edit, define a brush preset, it's going to fade out the edges. This is like a pretty big brush now. And you can make these big brushes too. The brushes should be bigger than smaller, but it should fade out my edges a little bit. So when I apply this, I don't get that hard edge. For the atmospheric brushes, it's good to fade it out. For the more architectural type brushes, it might not be necessary. Now, this is just one brush, so it's highly repetitive. So that's why I want you to get 6 brushes, because if you have 6 different atmospheric brushes, you can start to break things up a little bit more. The other thing you can do too is you can scale, make the brush bigger, smaller, and you can always paint in white too. So sometimes painting in white is a great way to break it, to not broke that up, paint top with black. So the other types of brushes are these architectural brushes. Talk about background brushes, and you can pick any skyline, let's say. So you can say city skyline, and you can find all sorts of things. But here too, you're going to have to adjust these. So I have a city here. So I'll copy this like that, what I want. I'll hide my layers here and then paste that in. And then here I'll play with the levels again. I'll make a selection, do a Command L, and push the triangle part all the way to the left, and maybe do the opposite with the other one. So I get more of a silhouette like this. Hit OK, and then go to Edit, define brush preset, call it city. And then, so what I want to do now is really start to think about foreground, background, and midground. So every time you add a new foreground or background, just make sure you do a new layer and then go ahead and start painting. So something like this. So sometimes with these brushes, you can just make it huge, make it black, and hit it once, and then you make a cityscape like that. Or you can make parts of it smaller and build it up. So there's a lot you can do there. Now, when you're creating your foreground, background, and midground, the other thing to remember about value is that value has dimensionality to it. And we'll talk about it more next week, because I have a project where we actually start to paint 3D objects thinking about value only. But foreground objects are usually darker. Background objects fade out. So for your foreground elements, you want to make those elements darker. So things in the foreground are going to be a lot darker. And that's because you always get just the way that light diffuses as things go off in the distance. So things tend to fade out the farther they go out into the distance. So that would be another layer here. And then the idea with these grunge brushes, I like to call them, you can just find telephone poles are great, girders like this is really good. Make a selection, then, and it's the same process here, doing levels, pushing to the left to make it lighter, pushing to the right, make it darker, and then defining it. So I'll call this grunge brush number 1, and then create a new layer, then adding this information. And you can, there's all sorts of things you can do. You can maybe rotate the brushes. One of the things I do is click multiple times too to darken things up. You can create something in a layer all by itself and then rotate it. So that would be, it's almost like you're looking through something to see the scene behind it. And that's the process. So you're going to do 3 of these, but you're going to think about all sorts of things. Like, what if you want like mountains in the background, planets, on the moon, people, vehicles. So that can go into your decision when you're collecting these brushes to create these environment type paintings. And that's the process. So I know there's not a lot of people here tonight, but any questions about this?
No, it's pretty clear.
Yeah, so it's a fun project, I think. This is more focused on concept development. You can to create your compositions in one Photoshop doc by grouping, clicking on the group, making an artboard. Actually, a better way to do it though is you can create that group, but go into the artboard tool and kind of drag over with the artboard tool so it's the exact size. And now and just have your artboard so you have everything in one document. 3 artboards, and then the next one, and then paint the next one using the brushes that you created. But yeah, just remember the brushes, you want to use those levels to get something that has high contrast. Creating more contrast is better. So that's why pushing the triangles in on your levels are going to create more contrast. As you create these brushes, just remember everything is going to go into the brushes panel. And so you might want to create folders, create a folder for atmospheric, create a folder for background brushes, and create a folder for the grunge style brushes. So you create your folders here just to organize the brushes as you. So this is the assignment then, coming up with these landscapes and then thinking about the theme too. So it's one world, but 3 different phases of that world. So yeah.
So I already did use these kinds of palettes if you think about it? Because remember we talked the last time when I was doing the architectural layout for the other project, the symmetry. So I ended
Yeah.
up using many of these. Okay.
Yeah, that's one situation where if you pick architecture for symmetry, then you could probably utilize some of those things. Two, this assignment and the symmetry assignment are very focused on concept art, digital painting for concept development type activities. So if you go to ArtStation, ArtStation is a great website to look at different concept artists. You'll see that they're using these techniques all the time. It's like this is the basis for some big, we call them matte paintings. So they do digital matte paintings and they create these digital landscapes that you use in a film, or just for the different types of digital paintings as well. You start with this, and then make sure you keep everything in separate layers as much as possible, and then save as a Photoshop format as you're doing it, .psd, the default format. But when you hand it in, you can right click on an artboard and quick export it as a PNG. But we want to save them in layers as Photoshop files because in the next assignment, what we're going to do is we're going to colorize them, and then we're going to connect them and together. We're going to blend them together to create one super long landscape, but then we're going to animate the foreground, background, and midground to create the illusion that you're traveling along the landscape itself. And we can do that in Photoshop. There's another program that's really interesting called Mental Canvas that's free, and it's an iPad type program. iPad, Windows, or Android app that's free that will let us do some interesting animation using our digital artwork.